Just before we start today's video, we want to bring you a word from our amazing sponsor, Rocket Money. I'm terrible for signing up for subscriptions, then forgetting about them. I frequently do it when researching. I'll sign up for a subscription to read something behind a paywall and then forget about it. Not to mention how many other subscriptions I've forgotten about, like streaming services. So that's why I was so happy to start using today's sponsor, Rocket Money. Rocket Money is an all-in-one personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower bills, and manage your money better. Rocket Money compiled a list of all my subscriptions, and with just a few taps, I canceled all the useless ones. In seconds, I was saving myself over $100 a month. I can't tell you what a sense of relief that was. I'm not the only one who loves this feature of Rocket Money. They've helped customers save over $500 million. Customers save up to $740 yearly when they use all of Rocket Money's premium features. Rocket Money also has several other amazing features that can help you save money, lower your bills, and set a budget. Rocket Money is such an amazing and useful tool. Please do yourself a favor and check it out to save money. To save more and spend less, join the over 500 million members using Rocket Money today. Go to rocketmoney.com/criminallylisted or click on the link in the description to get started for free. We want to say a big thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video. Number 3. Melvin Rees. On the evening of January 11th, 1959, 29-year-old Carol Jackson, a feed store employee, his 27-year-old wife, Mildred, and their two daughters, 4-year-old Janet and 17-month-old Susan, paid a visit to Mildred's parents in Buckner, Virginia. Around 9:40 p.m., they drove towards their home in Apple Grove, Virginia. However, they didn't make it home. Their car was found abandoned a short distance from Mildred's parents' home. It was clear they had been forced off the road and kidnapped. After the family's disappearance made the news, a couple contacted the police. They said earlier that night, a man in a blue car had tried to run them off the road, but they got away. 2 months later, the body of Carol Jackson was found in a ditch near Fredericksburg, Virginia. When his body was removed, the police found the body of 17-month-old Janet under his body. Carol had been pistol whipped in the head and then was shot once in the head. Janet had been hit in the head and dropped in the ditch alive. The pathologist believes she suffocated under her father's body. The police searched the area and they found the grips from a .38 caliber revolver. The police surmised they came off when Carol was being pistol whipped. The bodies of Mildred and Susan were not in the area. Then 2 weeks later, 27-year-old Mildred and 4-year-old Susan's bodies were found near Annapolis, Maryland. Mildred had been sexually assaulted and tortured and then punched repeatedly in the side of the head. She suffocated on her own blood after being beaten. Susan had also been beaten to death. The police searched the area. The police found an abandoned building a short distance from where the bodies were found. In the building, they found a button from Mildred's dress. They believe she was sexually assaulted in the building and then her body was partially buried with her daughters. The police thought there were similarities between the murders of the Jacksons and another murder that happened a year and a half earlier. On June 26, 1957, 35-year-old Margaret Harold and her date were parked in a car in a lover's lane in Indianapolis. Suddenly, an armed man got into the back seat. He demanded their money. Harold refused to give him any money, so he shot her twice in the back of the head. Harold's date bolted, and the killer fired 3 shots at him. He wasn't injured, and he ran to a nearby farmhouse. The police were summoned to the area. When they got to the area, they found 35-year-old Margaret Harold's nude dead body. The pathologist concluded she had been sexually assaulted after she was fatally shot in the head. The police searched the area, and close to the crime scene, they found an abandoned cinder block building. There were some bindings in the basement. Hours earlier, close by, a man approached another couple in their car. He tried to bind their hands, but the couple was able to escape with the bindings still on their wrists. The bindings were identical to the bindings found in the shack. The couple described the man to a sketch artist. Also, photos were plastered to one of the walls in the building. Some were pornographic. There were other photos of dead and mutilated women cut out of detective magazines. They also found a yearbook photo of a young woman named Wanda Tipton. The police contacted Tipton, and she said she had no idea how her photo ended up in the building. She also didn't know anyone who matched the description of the killer. Margaret Harold's case was still unsolved when the Jackson family was killed a year and a half later. While the police suspected the murders were connected, they had no idea who killed them. However, someone did. Shortly after the bodies of the Jacksons were found, the authorities received a letter from Glenn Moser. Moser wrote that he believed his friend, 30-year-old Melvin Rees, was the killer. He had been suspicious of Rees since the murder of Margaret Harold. Notably, Rees looked a lot like the sketch of the killer. Rees was also fascinated by sexual violence. His favorite writer was the French libertine Marquis de Sade, who was known for sadistic, sexually graphic material. Years earlier, Rees had been arrested for a sex crime. In 1955, a woman accused him of kidnapping her from a bus stop and sexually assaulting her. Rees did not go to trial because the woman decided to drop the charges. Moser and a friend decided to engage Rees in a philosophical discussion about the morality of murder. Moser was hoping he'd say something incriminating about Margaret Harold's murder. Moser thought that Rees was being evasive, but he didn't say anything incriminating. Then, one day, he directly asked Rees if he had killed Margaret Harold. Rees said he was offended by the accusation and he stormed out. However, he didn't deny committing the murder. The more Moser thought about it, the more unlikely it seemed that his friend, whom he had known since grade school, was a cold-blooded sex killer. Eventually, Moser convinced himself that Rees was innocent. Upon Moser's invitation, Rees moved in with him in a beach house in Norfolk, Virginia. They were living together in January 1959 when the Jackson family was murdered. Moser remembered the night they were kidnapped. Rees was a talented musician. He expertly played the saxophone, piano, and clarinet. He made money by playing in jazz bands and teaching music. On the night of the kidnapping, Rees was supposed to perform with a band at a nightclub in Washington, D.C. But he left late, and Moser didn't think he would have made it to the show on time. Before the Jacksons were kidnapped, a couple said that a man with dark hair in a blue car tried to drive them off the road. In his letter, Moser wrote that Rees drove a blue car. The authorities did not follow up on Glenn Moser's letter for months. Then, in the autumn of 1959, the FBI interviewed Moser several times and had him take a polygraph exam, which he passed. The FBI investigated Melvin Rees, and they found some incriminating information. Rees had attended the University of Maryland for several semesters in the mid-1950s. During that time, he had dated fellow student Wanda Tipton. Tipton's yearbook photo was found in the shack close to where Margaret Harold's body was found. The police got a search warrant for Rees' home in Hyattsville, Maryland, which is close to where Margaret Harold and Mildred and Susan Jackson were killed. The police found an accordion case hidden in the attic. In the case was a .38 caliber revolver with bloodstains on it. Pistol grips were found on the ground close to where Carol Jackson and his baby daughter Janet were killed. The grips perfectly fit into the handle of the pistol. The police found the person who sold the gun to Rees. He confirmed they were the grips on the gun he sold to Rees. Ballistic testing showed it was the weapon used to kill Carol Jackson and Margaret Harold. Also in the accordion case was a diary with passages written in Rees' handwriting. One entry included, quote, "Caught on a lonely road. After pulling them over, leveled pistol and ordered them out and into trunk was opened for husband and both bound. Drove to a select area and killed husband and baby. Now the mother and daughter were all mine," unquote. Below the writing were photos of Mildred and Susan that had been cut out of the newspaper. He drew a gag over Mildred's mouth. He then detailed how he sexually assaulted Mildred before killing her. In June 1960, Melvin Rees was arrested. Rees stood in a police lineup. The man who was with Margaret Harold when she was killed identified Rees as the murderer. In August 1958, a husband and wife were forced off the road by a young man with dark hair driving a blue car. At gunpoint, he forced them to get into his car. He took them to an isolated area where he sexually assaulted the woman. However, he decided to let them go. The woman identified Rees as the man who kidnapped them. Melvin Rees went to trial for the murders of Mildred and Susan Jackson first. Since they were kidnapped in Virginia and killed in Maryland, it was a federal case. The trial lasted about a month, and then the jury deliberated for 5 hours. Rees was found guilty. Months later, he was sentenced to life in prison. Rees was then extradited to Virginia for the murder of Carol Jackson. He went to trial in January 1961. The jury deliberated for 25 minutes and found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. Rees was charged with the murders of 17-month-old Susan Jackson and 35-year-old Margaret Harold, but since he already had a life sentence and a death sentence, it was decided he would not be tried for those murders. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional, so Rees' death sentence was commuted to life in prison. Besides those 5 murders, Melvin Rees is the prime suspect in several other murders. On the morning of June 15, 1955, 16-year-old Nancy Chomet and her neighbor, 14-year-old Michael Ann Ryan, set off walking towards Nancy's high school in College Park, Maryland, to pick up her report card. As they were walking in a park near some woods, someone opened fire on them. Nancy was shot 11 times, and Michael was shot 3 times. Their bodies were found about 2 hours after they left for school. Despite massive searches, the murder weapon was never found. It's believed it was a Marlin .22 caliber repeating rifle. Some construction workers near the park saw a man with a rifle that morning. A sketch was made public, and it looks like Melvin Rees. At the time, Rees was attending the University of Maryland, which was close to the park. However, Rees never confessed to these murders. Supposedly, in 1996, another man confessed to the double murder on his deathbed. That man, James Dobik, was 17 years old at the time of the murders. However, none of the details in his deathbed confession match the crime scene. So the police doubt its veracity, and Melvin Rees is still the prime suspect in the murders. We covered James Dobik's supposed deathbed confession in 3 Haunting Deathbed Confessions Part 3. We'll have a link to that video at the end of this video. Rees is also the suspect in another set of murders. In 1985, in an interview with a reporter, Rees confessed to the murders of the Jackson family and Margaret Harold. He also confessed to another set of murders. On June 1, 1956, 18-year-old Mary Elizabeth Fellers and 16-year-old Shelby Jean Venable were last seen getting into a blue car in Laurel, Maryland. A week later, Mary's body was found floating in the Potomac River. 5 days later, Shelby's nude body was found in a creek about 9 miles from where Elizabeth's body was found. The creek was off the Potomac River. Mary's cause of death could not be determined, and Shelley had been strangled to death. Rees said that during his murder spree, he was addicted to amphetamines. He was asked if he had any remorse for the murders. He said it wasn't hard to live with because he had found religion and knew he had been forgiven. Melvin Rees, who was nicknamed the Sex Beast, was never released from custody. He died in August 1995 at age 66. Number 2. Danny Rolling. On August 26, 1990, the police were called to the apartment of 18-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell in Gainesville, Florida. No one had heard from them in 3 days. Sonia and Christina were both students at the University of Florida. Their apartment was about a mile from the university's main campus. Sonia wanted to be an elementary school teacher, and Christina was a theology student. When the police got to their apartment, they found a gruesome scene. Sonia Larson had been beaten, sexually assaulted, stabbed multiple times, and mutilated. Christina Powell had also been sexually assaulted and stabbed 5 times in the chest and the back. Her body was posed in a sexually suggestive manner. Both women had been bound with tape. The killer had removed the tape and taken it with him. The killer also tried to destroy physical evidence by washing the victims with dish soap. Nothing had been stolen, and there were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. The next day, the police were called to another woman's apartment about 3 miles away. 18-year-old Krista Hoyt attended Santa Fe Community College. She was also a part-time records clerk for the sheriff's department. A sheriff's deputy went to her apartment when she didn't show up for work. He found a gruesome scene in her apartment. Krista's disemboweled body was posed so it was sitting on the edge of the bed. She had also been decapitated. Her head was sitting upright on the top shelf of a bookcase in the bedroom. The head was posed to make it look like it was staring at the body. She had been stabbed multiple times. It's believed that the killer removed the latch on the sliding glass door when she was out. He waited inside for her to return home and then attacked her. Like the other 2 victims, Krista had been bound with tape, but the killer took the tape with him. The police were sure that all 3 murders were the work of one man. Unfortunately, they had no idea who he was. On August 28, 1990, for the 3rd day in a row, the police were called to an apartment where students lived. Manuel Taboado and Tracy Paulus were both 23 and lived together. They were just roommates and not romantically involved. Tracy liked having a male roommate because it made her feel safe. Manuel was a large man who played offensive guard in high school. Tracy had been stabbed 3 times and Manuel had been stabbed 31 times. Tracy had been sexually assaulted before and after death. These 2 murders were different than the other 3. Notably, there were pry marks on the door frame, so it's believed that the killer had broken in. Secondly, neither body was mutilated, but they were sure it was the same man who killed them. They thought that the killer was possibly disrupted before he could do anything to their bodies. The police determined that Sonia Larson and Christina Powell were murdered on August 24th, Krista Hoyt on the 25th, and Tracy Paulus and Manuel Taboada were killed on the 27th. The media dubbed the killer the Gainesville Ripper. In the days after the murders, the police did not make an arrest in the case, but they did have a suspect, 18-year-old Edward Humphrey. Humphrey had scars on his face from a car accident. He had a history of mental illness. He was also known to carry knives. Humphrey had lived in the same apartment building as the last murder victims, Manuel Taboada and Tracy Paulus. He supposedly had a crush on Tracy. On August 30th, 1990, 2 days after Tracy and Manuel's bodies were found, Humphrey was arrested for assaulting his grandmother. However, the police found no physical evidence, like fingerprints, that placed Humphrey at any of the crime scenes. DNA had been found at all 3 crime scenes, and it belonged to the same man. In October 1990, the police learned it was not Humphrey's DNA, so he was cleared as a suspect. Around the same time that the police learned that Humphrey's DNA did not match the Gainesville Ripper's DNA, the Miami Herald published an article about the similarities between the Gainesville serial murders and the mass murder in Shreveport, Louisiana, nearly 10 months earlier. 55-year-old Tom Grissom lived with his 24-year-old daughter, Julie, and his 8-year-old grandson, Sean Grissom. Sean was Julie's nephew. On November 6, 1989, their family could not get a hold of them. They called the police and asked them to go to the home to check on them. 55-year-old Tom Grissom's body was found in the laundry room. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. 8-year-old Sean had been murdered in the living room. He had been stabbed once in the chest. The blade went through his torso and came out his back. The nude, dead body of 24-year-old Julie was in her bed. It was lying in a sexually suggestive manner. She had been stabbed and slashed repeatedly in the back with a knife. The killer had also bitten her breasts. The killer had used vinegar to try to destroy physical evidence on and inside Julie's body. Julie had been bound with tape, and the killer had taken the tape with him. It is believed the mass murder was committed the night before the bodies were found. The Miami Herald pointed out that all the targets of the murders were young, petite brunettes. In Julie Grissom's murder and some of the Gainesville murders, the killer had used cleaning liquid, like vinegar and dish soap, to wash areas of the victim's body, hoping to destroy evidence. Also, the killer used tape to bind the victims and took the tape with him. Several of the bodies have been posed in a sexually suggestive manner by the killer. Notably, their hair was fanned out over their heads. The Gainesville police had been talking to the police in Shreveport for months before the article was published. Initially, they did not believe it was committed by the same man. But after Edward Humphrey was eliminated as a suspect, they thought that there was a good chance the mass murder in Shreveport and the serial murders in Gainesville were connected. But they didn't know who was responsible for the 8 murders. Then, weeks later, in November 1990, the police were given the name of a person to investigate, Danny Harold Rolling. A woman living in Shreveport called Crime Stoppers because she had the nagging feeling that Danny was the killer. The woman explained that she and her husband had befriended Danny when they met him at church. He came over to their Shreveport home frequently. Then, one day, several months after the Grissoms were murdered, her husband said Rolling was no longer welcome at their home. Rolling had admitted to him that he liked to stab people. At the end of August 1990, the woman was in the Florida Panhandle and she heard about the Gainesville Ripper murders. Something Danny said frequently stuck out to her and kept nagging at her. He said, quote, "One day I'm going to leave this town and I'm going to where the girls are beautiful and I can just lie in the sun and watch beautiful women all day," unquote. So the police began to investigate Danny Rolling. Danny was born in May 1954 in Shreveport. His father, James, was a police officer. James had a traumatic childhood and his family was plagued by serious mental illness. One day when James was a boy, his grandmother was soaking her feet. His grandfather came up behind her and slit her throat. James witnessed the murder. James was incredibly abusive to his wife, Claudia, and his sons, Danny and Danny's younger brother, Kevin. He started being Danny when he was just a toddler. As Danny got older, he was beaten several times a week. His mother left his father several times, but always came back. Danny was held back in school several times because he missed class so often because of the abuse. When Danny was 11, he started drinking. He then started using drugs like marijuana and LSD. In July 1979, 25-year-old Danny was sentenced to 6 years in prison for robbing 3 grocery stores. He tried to escape several times. He was released in June 1984. In March 1986, 31-year-old Danny was convicted again of robbing a grocery store, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was paroled in July 1988. A year and a half later, the Grissams were killed. About 6 months after the mass murder, on May 18, 1990, 35-year-old Danny got into an argument with his father. It turned into a gunfight between the two men. Danny was unharmed, but his father was shot in the stomach and the forehead. His father survived, but he lost an eye and an ear. Believing he had killed his father, Danny fled town. In November 1990, when the police began to investigate Danny Rolling, he wasn't difficult to find. He was serving a life sentence in Florida. On September 7, 1990, less than 2 weeks after the Gainesville murders, Danny robbed a grocery store in Ocala, Florida. He led the police on a high-speed chase as he tried to escape, and he crashed his car. He was unharmed and taken into custody. On September 17, 1990, Danny pleaded guilty to robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison because he was a repeat offender. Knowing Danny's background gave the police new insight into the investigation. Hours before Krista Hoyt was killed, there was a bank robbery about half a mile from her home. Since Rolling had a history of committing armed robberies, the police thought it was possible he robbed the bank. During the robbery, a teller put a dye pack in the bag with the money she gave to the robber. Hours after the bank robbery, a police officer saw two men acting suspiciously near the edge of the woods close to the bank. The officer followed them back to their campsite in the woods. When he ordered them to stop, one man ran away. The officer arrested the other man. He said he knew nothing about the other man. He had nothing to do with the bank robbery. The officer searched the campsite and found several things, including dye-stained money, a brown ski mask, a 9mm handgun, and a cassette player with a tape in it. At the time, the police had no reason to suspect that any of the items were connected to the murders. After all the victims had been stabbed and not shot. The police did not listen to the tape in the recorder. Luckily, it was still being stored in the evidence locker. They retrieved the tape and listened to it. It was a recording of a man singing and talking. Then the man said his full name, Danny Rolling. The police now had evidence that Danny was in the area during the Gainesville Ripper murders. In January 1991, while in prison, Danny had a tooth extracted. A DNA profile was created from the tooth. It was then compared to the DNA of the Gainesville Ripper. It was a match. In November 1991, Danny Rolling was charged with 5 murders. Danny eventually confessed to the murders, but he did it in an odd way. He had another inmate, Bobby Lewis, who was on death row for killing a drug dealer, write his confession. Danny then agreed to meet with the investigators, but only if Lewis confessed for him. Lewis detailed the murders and told the police only things the killer would have known. Then the detectives asked Danny if the statements were true, and he confirmed that they were. Lewis told detectives new details about the murders they didn't know. For example, after killing Krista Hoyt, Danny returned to the crime scene because he thought he had left his wallet there. It was when he returned that he decided to decapitate her. Danny explained that he had multiple personalities. One was Nad, which is Danny spelled backwards. He said Nad was not a good person, but he wasn't evil. The other personality, Gemini, was the evil personality that was responsible for the murders. Danny Rolling went to trial in Florida in February 1994. He pleaded guilty to the murders, so the trial was to see if he should be sentenced to death or life in prison. His lawyer argued for leniency because Danny had suffered horrifying abuse at the hands of his father. He also said that Danny had a history of mental illness. Danny also claimed he had multiple personalities. The prosecution argued that Danny was lying about the other personalities. They claimed he got the idea from seeing the movie The Exorcist 3, which he saw in Gainesville. Danny Rolling was sentenced to death. He spent 12 years on death row. Danny was scheduled to die on October 25, 2006. Danny's last meal was lobster tail, butterfly shrimp, baked potato, strawberry cheesecake, and sweet tea. Before he was taken to the death chamber, he handed a note to his spiritual advisor. In the note, he confessed to the murders of the Grissoms. For Danny's last statement, he sang Christian songs for 2 minutes. 52-year-old Danny Harold Rolling was pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m. Danny Rolling and his brutal series of murders in Gainesville were the inspiration for the 1996 slasher film Scream. Number 1. Herbert Mullins. Herbert Mullins was born in Salinas, California on April 18, 1947. When Mullins was 5, his family moved to San Francisco. Years later, when he was in middle school, they moved to Felton, California. Mullins had a stable family life and he didn't suffer any abuse. His family was devoutly Catholic. Mullins was a bright young man, and in high school, he was voted most likely to succeed. But he was prone to believing in bizarre conspiracies. For example, he believed his father did not sexually abuse him because his father hated him. In June 1965, one of Mullins' best friends, 8-year-old Dean Richardson, was killed in a motorcycle accident. Mullins was devastated by the loss of his friend. To deal with his grief, he built a shrine to his dead friend in his bedroom. During this time, Mullins became fascinated with reincarnation. Dean's death is often cited as the breaking point for Mullins' mental health. His behavior became more outrageous. For example, he repeatedly asked his sister to have sex with him. He would get angry when she rejected him because he thought she didn't love him. Around this time, Mullins began to use marijuana and LSD. In September 1965, Mullins attended Cabrillo College in Aptos, California, where he majored in road engineering. He graduated after 2 years. In the autumn of 1967, he was enrolled at San Jose State College. Initially, he planned on studying engineering, but then he changed his major to philosophy. He dropped out after a semester. In his 20s, Mullins continued to lose touch with reality. He also started hearing voices. In early 1969, he did something his family found incredibly odd. His family was having dinner, and Mullins copied every movement his brother-in-law made. For example, anytime his brother-in-law drank, Mullins would drink as well. It was a case of echopraxia, which is a symptom of schizophrenia. This incident led to 21-year-old Herbert Mullins being hospitalized for the first time. He spent 6 weeks in the hospital. A month later, he checked himself in again at the hospital. He only stayed in the hospital for a short time. In October 1969, a friend thought that Mullins was acting weird, so he called his uncle, a physician. The physician saw that Mullins was mentally disturbed and showed signs of schizophrenia. For a third time, Mullins was hospitalized. This time, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He spent 8 weeks in the hospital. Between 1969 and 1972, Mullins was hospitalized at least half a dozen times in 5 different facilities for his mental health problems. Mullins was arrested several times for drugs, but he was never convicted. He was also never arrested for any violent crimes. In May 1974, Mullins was doing research in the library and discovered that famed physicist Albert Einstein died on his 5th birthday. He thought this was evidence that he was meant for greatness. Eventually, he came to believe he was the reincarnation of Einstein. When Mullins was in his mid-20s, the voices told him he needed to sacrifice humans or earthquakes would destroy California. Mullins was born on the 41st anniversary of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. It was the most destructive earthquake in American history. Over 3,000 people were killed, and 80% of the city was destroyed. In the fall of 1972, Mullins lived with his parents in Felton. On October 13, 1972, Mullins came across Lawrence White, a 55-year-old transient. According to Mullins, White telepathically told him he volunteered to be sacrificed. Mullins pulled his car over and pretended he had car trouble. White approached him, offering him help. Mullins got a baseball bat out of the trunk of his car and struck White in the head. Mullins planned to stab him in the heart, but the blow to the head killed the 55-year-old man. 11 days later, Mullins picked up 24-year-old Mary Guilfoyle as she was hitchhiking. He turned onto a quiet street and stabbed her in the chest with a hunting knife. She died within minutes. He took the body to a wooded area in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He disemboweled and deboned her leg, looking for signs of pollution in her body. Guilfoyle's body was not found for months. On November 2, 1972, Mullins went to a Catholic church in Los Gatos, California. Mullins sat in the confessional opposite 64-year-old Father Henri Tomei. Mullins confessed to the priest that he had committed 2 murders. Mullins believed that Tomei communicated with him through their minds and volunteered to be the next sacrifice. Mullins pulled the priest out of the confessional and beat and stomped him. He then pulled out his hunting knife and stabbed Tomei in the heart. Mullins then fled the church. For a long time, Mullins had blamed marijuana for his problems. He believed it had damaged his brain. Also, all his arrests had been drug-related. He had wanted to get into the Marines, but believed his arrest record, which included him being checked in mental health facilities, would disqualify him. Mullins believed his introduction to drugs was part of a conspiracy to destroy his life. He was introduced to marijuana by his friend Jim Gennaria. On January 25, 1974, Mullins went to Jim's last known address, but he no longer lived there. The new resident gave him Jim's new address. Mullins went to Jim's new home, and Jim let him in. Mullins shot 25-year-old Jim 3 times. Mullins then shot Jim's 21-year-old wife, Joan, 3 times in the face. He wanted to make sure she was dead, so he stabbed her 3 times with a hunting knife. After murdering the couple, Mullins realized that someone might be able to connect him to the murders, 29-year-old Kathy Francis. Kathy lived in Jim's old home and had given Mullins Jim's new address. So Mullins drove to Kathy's home and knocked on the door. When Kathy opened the door, he shot the 29-year-old woman in the head. He then entered the home and found Kathy's 2 sons, 9-year-old David Hughes and 4-year-old Damien. He shot them both in the head. Shortly after the 5 murders, Mary Guilfoyle's remains were found. About 2 weeks after the 5 murders, on February 10, 1973, Mullins was hiking in Herbert Redwood State Park in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He came across 18-year-old David Oliker, 15-year-old Mark Trebelbis, 18-year-old Robert Spector, and 19-year-old Brian Card, who were camping. Mullins told them to clear out because what they were doing was illegal. The 4 young men mocked him. Mullins then claimed he was a park ranger and they had to leave. The boys challenged him, and he could not prove he was a ranger. So Mullins walked away from the boys. After dark, Mullins returned to the campsite where the boys were camping. All the boys were in sleeping bags in their tent. He shot them all in the forehead. He stole their money and a .22 caliber rifle. 3 days later, on February 13, 1973, Mullins was driving in Santa Cruz, California. He spotted 72-year-old Fred Perez, who was working in his garden. Mullins pulled over, took out the rifle he had stolen 3 days earlier, and shot Perez in the chest. A neighbor witnessed the murder and wrote down Mullins' license plate. A few minutes later, Mullins was arrested without incident. On the seat beside him was the .22 caliber pistol he used to kill his last 9 victims. The bodies of the 4 young men were found 4 days after Mullins was arrested. The police found other evidence that connected Mullins to the murders. In his apartment, they found Father Tomei's rosary and an address book with Jim Gennara's address written in it. They also found Mullins' fingerprints in the confessional. 25-year-old Herbert Mullins confessed to killing 13 people in 4 months. He was initially charged with 10 of the 13 murders. He was not charged with the first 3 murders: Lawrence White, Mary Guilfoyle, and Henri Tomei. The prosecution and the defense agreed to focus on the 10 murders to simplify the trial. Mullins wanted to act as his own attorney and plead guilty. However, he was found not competent enough to serve as his own attorney, but he was competent enough to stand trial. Herbert Mullins' trial for the 10 murders started on July 30th, 1973. Mullins pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. He had a documented history of mental illness, and he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Mullins testified about the voices commanding him to kill to stop the earthquakes. The prosecution's psychiatrists agreed that Mullins had schizophrenia. However, they asserted that Mullins knew that committing the murders was wrong. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury deliberated for 2 days. Mullins was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the murders of Joan and Jim Gennara, and 8 counts of second-degree murder for the murders of Kathy Francis, her 2 sons, and the 4 teenage boys who were camping. In September, Mullins was sentenced to life in prison for the first-degree murder convictions and 5 years to life for the second-degree murder convictions. He was once again sentenced to 5 years to life. Since Mullins had already been sentenced 11 times to life in prison, the district attorney chose not to try him for the murders of his first 2 victims, Lawrence White and Mary Guilfoyle. Mullins was able to apply for parole after 7 years in 1980. He was denied. Over the next 22 years, he applied for parole 10 times. He was denied each time. In August 2022, Herbert Mullins died in prison at age 75. He had served about 49 years of prison. Thank you so much for watching today's video. We just want to remind you we started a channel membership where half the funds will go to solve a cold case. For more information, click on the video that's on the screen now. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.